The dust swirled across the platform as the train whistle pierced the afternoon air, announcing its arrival to the small town of Julesburg, Colorado. Ross Thornton adjusted his hat and tugged at his vest, suddenly conscious of the threadbare edges and faded color. At 35, he'd spent more time with cattle than people, and the thought of meeting his mail-order bride sent his heart racing faster than a spooked Mustang. He hadn't specified age in his advertisement, just requested someone sensible, hardworking, and God-fearing, and had almost forgotten the arrangement until the telegram arrived yesterday confirming her arrival on today's train. The year was 1878, and Julesburg was finally growing beyond its rough and tumble beginnings. Still, ranch life was lonely, especially since Ross's parents had passed within 6 months of each other 3 years ago, leaving him the sprawling but struggling cattle operation 15 miles outside of town. The train hissed to a stop, belching steam that momentarily obscured the passengers disembarking. Ross stood straighter, squinting through the cloud. He clutched the small wooden carving of a horse he'd made as a welcome gift, suddenly feeling foolish for not bringing flowers instead. As the steam cleared, the passengers emerged one by one. A young couple with 3 children, a businessman in a fine suit, 2 older gentlemen engaged in animated conversation. Then, standing alone on the platform, a woman in a simple blue dress, clutching a worn carpetbag in one hand and a small valise in the other. Her auburn hair was streaked with silver and pulled back in a practical bun. She stood tall, scanning the platform with an air of calm dignity that immediately caught Ross's attention. This couldn't be his bride, could it? The woman had to be in her 40s at least. Ross had expected someone younger, perhaps in her 20s like most mail-order brides. Yet something about her steady gaze and the resolute set of her shoulders drew him forward. "Miss Harriet Blackburn?" he asked tentatively, approaching her. The woman's eyes, a clear, intelligent hazel, assessed him quickly. "Mr. Thornton, I presume?" Her voice was melodious but firm, with the slightest hint of an Eastern accent. Ross nodded, suddenly tongue-tied. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes and mouth, testifying to years of laughter and hardship alike. She was handsome rather than pretty, with high cheekbones and a determined chin, definitely older than he'd anticipated. "I'm pleased to meet you," he managed, awkwardly extending the wooden horse. "Welcome to Julesburg." A smile transformed her face as she accepted his gift, examining the carving with genuine appreciation. "This is lovely craftsmanship, Mr. Thornton." "Ross, please," he said, finding his voice at last. "Then I'm Harriet," she replied, her smile reaching her eyes. "Though most call me Hattie." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, broken only by the continuing bustle of the station. Ross knew he should say something, but his mind had gone blank as a fresh sheet of paper. Hattie saved him the trouble. "I imagine I'm not quite what you were expecting," she said directly, no hint of embarrassment in her tone. Ross cleared his throat. Well, truth be told, I hadn't given much thought to age. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either." "I'm 43, Mr. Thornton Ross," she said forthrightly. "My husband passed 6 years ago, and with my children grown, I found myself at loose ends in Boston. Your advertisement mentioned a need for practicality and good sense rather than youth and beauty." Something about her straightforward manner loosened the knot in Ross's chest. "Good," he said with unexpected conviction. "I need someone with wisdom, not a girl who'll wilt at the first sign of hardship." The words emerged before he could consider them, but as soon as they were spoken, he knew them to be true. Surprise flickered across Hattie's face, followed by something that might have been relief. Then perhaps this arrangement might work after all, she said. Ross offered her a genuine smile and reached for her bags. My wagon's this way. It's about an hour's ride to the ranch. I should warn you, Hattie said as they walked, I'm no shrinking violet. I managed my late husband's mercantile business for 2 years after his passing, before my son was old enough to take it over. That's a point in your favor as far as I'm concerned, Ross replied. Running a ranch takes grit. As they reached his wagon, weathered but well-maintained, Ross helped Hattie up to the seat with as much gentlemanly care as his rough hands could manage. He noticed she moved with ease, requiring little assistance. Is this all your luggage? He asked, securing her bags in the back. I've never been one for excess, she answered. I brought practical clothes, some books, family keepsakes, and my sewing kit. What more would I need? Ross nodded approvingly as he climbed up beside her. A practical woman indeed. Maybe this unexpected turn of events was providence rather than misfortune. As they pulled away from the station, Hattie looked straight ahead at the vast landscape stretching before them. You should know, Mr. Thornton, that while I've agreed to this arrangement, I haven't yet agreed to marriage. I thought we might get to know one another first. Ross felt his ears redden. That seems sensible, he managed. I've prepared the old foreman's cabin for you. It's small but sound, about 50 yards from the main house. Thank you, she said simply. That's very thoughtful. As the wagon rumbled out of town, Ross found himself stealing glances at his unexpected bride-to-be. There was something compelling about her profile against the vast Colorado sky, something steady and enduring, like the mountains on the horizon. They traveled in companionable silence for a while before Ross ventured. If you don't mind my asking, what made you answer my advertisement? Surely there were opportunities in Boston. Hattie considered the question before answering. After my husband died, I discovered something unexpected. I enjoyed the challenge of running the business. When my son took over, I found myself restless, unnecessary. The women in my circle expected me to settle into comfortable widowhood, but she paused. I wasn't ready for that. Your advertisement spoke of building something, of practicality and work. It sounded like a place where I might be valued for more than just proper manners and a sympathetic ear. Her honesty touched something in Ross. My ranch is struggling, he admitted. The drought last summer hit us hard and I lost too many head. I need a partner, not just a wife to cook and clean, someone to help make decisions, to work alongside me. Then perhaps we both might find what we're looking for, Hattie said, meeting his gaze directly. As they continued their journey, Ross pointed out landmarks, explaining the lay of the land. He found Hattie asked intelligent questions about water sources, grazing rotations, and market conditions, questions that revealed she'd done research before coming west. It was refreshing to talk to someone who seemed genuinely interested in the practical aspects of ranch life. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky when they crested the final rise, revealing Thornton Ranch spread out below them. The main house was a sturdy 2-story structure of weathered wood, with a broad porch wrapping around 3 sides. A large barn stood nearby, along with several outbuildings and corrals. The smaller foreman's cabin was visible just as Ross had described, a short distance from the main house. It's not grand, Ross said apologetically, but it's solid. My father built the main house when he married my mother. Added on the second floor when my sister was born. You have a sister? Hattie asked, seeming surprised at this first mention of family. Had, Ross corrected softly. Rebecca died of typhoid when she was 16. I was 14 then. I'm sorry, Hattie said, her voice gentle. After a moment she added, it looks like a proper home to me, built to last. As they approached, a lanky young man emerged from the barn, waving in greeting. That's Caleb, Ross explained. He's 19, been working for me since he was 15, good with horses. Lives in the bunkhouse with Miguel, who handles most of the cattle work. They'll both be curious about you, but they're decent fellows. Hattie nodded, taking it all in. And who's that? She asked, pointing to an older man emerging from the house, wiping his hands on an apron. That's Chen Y, though everyone calls him Charlie. He came over to work on the railroad 20 years ago, stayed on when the work was done. Best cook in 3 counties, and he runs the house like it's his personal kingdom. My father hired him years back after my mother took ill, and he's been part of the place ever since. Quite the collection of people, Hattie observed. Ross shrugged. Out here, you build your family from who's available, I suppose. As the wagon pulled into the yard, Charlie approached with a curious expression that transformed into outright surprise when he saw Hattie. Ross braced himself for an awkward moment, but the older man recovered quickly, offering a bow. "Welcome, Mrs.," he said in accented English. "Dinner almost ready." "Thank you, Charlie," Hattie replied warmly. "It smells wonderful." Ross helped Hattie down from the wagon, then grabbed her bags. "I'll show you to the cabin first so you can freshen up before dinner if you'd like." The foreman's cabin was simple but clean, with a small front room containing a table, 2 chairs, and a rocking chair by the stone fireplace. The bedroom held a neatly made bed, a chest of drawers, and a small mirror. A washstand stood in the corner with a fresh pitcher of water. "I had Charlie air it out and put on clean linens," Ross said, setting down her bags. "The pump is just outside and there's an outhouse around back. It's not fancy, but it's perfect," Hattie interrupted, running her hand over the smooth wood of the table. "You've been very thoughtful, Ross." "Thank you. Dinner's at 6, he said, suddenly awkward again. I'll leave you to settle in." As he turned to go, Hattie called after him. "Ross," he looked back. "Yes. I appreciate your honesty today. Not every man would have been so accepting of the situation." Ross considered this. "Truth is, Miss Hattie, I've spent my life working this land. It ages a person differently than city life. I'm 35, but some days I feel 60. Other days, I feel like the same scared boy who watched his sister die and didn't know how to comfort his mother." He paused, surprised at his own candor. "What I'm trying to say is I don't put much stock in numbers. Character is what matters out here." Hattie's eyes softened. "Well said, Mr. Thornton." After a moment, she added, "I'll see you at dinner." Ross walked back to the main house, his mind whirling. This day had gone nothing like he'd expected, yet he couldn't bring himself to feel disappointed. There was something about Harriet Blackburn that felt right, like finding a tool that fits perfectly in your hand after trying many that don't. Charlie was waiting for him in the kitchen, eyebrows raised in silent question. "She's older than I expected," Ross admitted before the cook could ask. "But I think she might be exactly what this place needs." Charlie nodded sagely. "Young wife, young troubles. Wise wife, wise home." Ross laughed. "When did you become a philosopher, old man?" Charlie shrugged, returning to his cooking. "Learn many things in long life. Most important, good judgment come from experience. Experience come from bad judgment." Ross considered this as he washed up for dinner. Maybe his years of solitude had taught him something after all, the wisdom to recognize value when he saw it, even if it came in an unexpected package. By the time Hattie knocked on the main house door, Ross had changed his shirt and made an attempt to tame his unruly brown hair. He opened the door to find her similarly refreshed, her hair now in a simpler braid down her back, wearing a different dress of soft gray. "Something smells wonderful," she said by way of greeting. "Charlie's beef stew," Ross replied, ushering her in. "Best you'll ever taste. He guards his recipe like gold." The main floor of the house was largely open, with a sitting area centered around the stone fireplace and a large dining table capable of seating 8. The kitchen occupied the back portion, separated by a partial wall. Simple but comfortable furniture filled the space, along with bookshelves containing a surprising number of volumes. "You like to read?" Hattie asked, noticing the direction of her gaze. "My mother was a school teacher before she married," Ross explained. "She believed in education, even out here in the wilds. Made sure I could quote Shakespeare while I was mucking out stalls." This earned him a genuine laugh from Hattie, a warm sound that seemed to brighten the room. Dinner was indeed delicious, and conversation flowed more easily than Ross had dared hope. Caleb and Miguel joined them, both clearly curious about the newcomer but polite in their questions. Hattie handled their curiosity with grace, sharing stories of Boston that had them all entranced. "So this gentleman thought he could cheat me on the price of the wool shipment," she was saying, recounting a tale from her time running the mercantile. "Claimed the quality was lower than promised." I pulled out the sample he'd approved the month before, along with his signed agreement, and suggested perhaps his memory was failing along with his eyesight. Her eyes twinkled. "He paid the full amount and even brought flowers the next week, trying to smooth things over." Caleb hooted with laughter. "Bet he didn't try that again." "Not with me, at least," Hattie agreed, sipping her coffee. As the meal concluded, Caleb and Miguel excused themselves, and Charlie began clearing the table, refusing Hattie's offer of help with a firm shake of his head. "First night, you guessed," he insisted. "Tomorrow, maybe you help." Left alone at the table, Ross and Hattie fell into momentary silence. "Your men seem devoted to you," she observed. Ross shrugged. "We've been through hard times together. Drought, blizzards, cattle thieves. Builds a bond." "Tell me about the ranch," Hattie said. "The real state of things. If we're to consider a future together, I should know what I'm getting into." Ross appreciated her directness. He spent the next hour outlining the ranch's operations. The cattle herd, currently at about 400 head but down from 600 the previous year. The small horse breeding operation he'd started, focusing on sturdy, intelligent mounts for ranch work. The challenges of water access during drought years, and the financial pressure of the bank loan his father had taken out to expand the herd 5 years before his death. Hattie listened attentively, asking pointed questions that revealed a sharp mind for business. "And what's your plan for repayment?" she asked regarding the loan. "The next cattle drive to Cheyenne should clear about half of what's remaining," Ross explained. "If we can increase the herd size again by next spring, another good drive should take care of the rest. And if the drought returns, or disease strikes the herd," Ross sighed, "then we're in trouble. I've been setting aside a portion of the horse sales as a safety net, but it wouldn't last long if real disaster struck." Hattie nodded thoughtfully. "Have you considered diversifying further? Perhaps dedicating some acreage to crops that would thrive in this climate?" "Not much grows easily out here," Ross said, "but some things must. The native peoples survived here for generations before ranchers arrived." It was a perspective Ross hadn't considered. "I suppose that's true. What did you have in mind?" Their conversation continued late into the evening, ranging from practical ranch matters to more personal history. Ross found himself sharing stories of his childhood on the ranch, of his father's determination to build something lasting and his mother's quiet strength. "They sound like remarkable people," Hattie said softly. "They were," Ross agreed. "I wish you could have met them." The words hung in the air, carrying more weight than he'd intended. Finally, noticing Hattie stifle a yawn, Ross rose. "You must be exhausted after your journey. Let me walk you back to the cabin." The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky in dazzling profusion. Hattie gasped at the sight. You never see stars like this in Boston, she murmured. It's as if you could reach up and touch them. That's one thing we have plenty of out here, Ross said, space and sky. At the cabin door they paused awkwardly. Thank you for today, Hattie said. For your honesty and your welcome. Thank you for coming, Ross replied. I know it was a leap of faith. As was your acceptance of me, she countered with a small smile. Sleep well, Hattie. Tomorrow, if you're up to it, I'll show you around the property. I'd like that very much. As Ross walked back to the main house, he found himself whistling softly. The day had turned out nothing like he'd expected, but somehow it felt right. Harriet Blackburn might be older than he'd anticipated, but she possessed exactly the kind of wisdom and strength he needed both for the ranch and, perhaps, for himself. Dawn broke early over Thornton Ranch, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Ross had been up for an hour already, checking on a pregnant mare in the barn and discussing the day's work with Miguel. As he crossed the yard, he noticed smoke rising from the chimney of the foreman's cabin. Apparently, Hattie was an early riser too. He had just reached the back porch when the cabin door opened, and Hattie emerged, dressed in a practical brown skirt and cream-colored blouse, her hair again in a simple braid. She spotted him and raised a hand in greeting before walking briskly toward the main house. "Good morning," she called as she approached. "I hope I'm not too early for breakfast." "Not at all," Ross replied. "Charlie's been up since before dawn, says he can't break the habit of 40 years. In the kitchen, they found Charlie expertly flipping flapjacks on the large cast iron stove. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air. "Morning, Mrs." Charlie greeted Hattie. "Sleep good." "Very well, thank you," she replied. "And please call me Hattie. Mrs. makes me feel like my mother-in-law." Charlie's weathered face creased in a smile as he slid a plate of steaming flapjacks onto the table. "Eat plenty. Need strength for ranch tour." As they ate, Caleb and Miguel joined them, their initial shyness around Hattie already fading. The conversation flowed easily, focusing on the day's tasks. Ross noticed how naturally Hattie asked questions, drawing out information about the ranch operations. "I thought we'd start with the main pastures and work our way back to the horse breeding operation," Ross told Hattie as they finished breakfast. "Can you ride?" "I learned as a girl visiting my grandparents' farm in Vermont," she answered. "Though it's been some years, I'll admit." "We'll take it slow," Ross promised. "I have a gentle mare who should suit you fine." An hour later, they were riding across the eastern pasture, the morning sun warm on their backs. Ross had been pleased to see that Hattie sat a horse with natural ease, quickly regaining her confidence in the saddle. The mare he'd chosen for her, a dapple gray named Pepper, seemed equally pleased with her rider. "The property runs from that creek to the north all the way to those hills to the south," Ross explained, gesturing broadly. "About 15,000 acres all told, though only about half is good grazing land. The rest is too rocky or steep." "It's beautiful," Hattie said, her eyes taking in the sweep of land, the distant mountains blue in the morning haze. "Different from anything I've known, but beautiful in its own right." They rode for several hours, Ross pointing out water sources, explaining grazing rotation strategies, and showing her the boundaries of the property. He found himself impressed by Hattie's stamina and her genuine interest in every aspect of the operation. By midday, they had reached a small plateau overlooking much of the ranch. Ross suggested they stop for the lunch Charlie had packed for them: cold chicken, biscuits, and apple preserves, along with a jug of cool water. As they sat on a fallen log, enjoying the food and the view, Hattie asked, "How many men did you typically employ before the drought reduced your herd?" "Usually 5 or 6 during the busy seasons," Ross answered. Down to Caleb and Miguel now, plus Charlie for the house. I had to let the others go when we lost so many cattle. Good men, all of them. I wrote recommendations to other ranchers in the territory. That couldn't have been easy, Hattie observed. Ross shook his head. Hardest thing I've ever had to do. Some had been with us since my father's time. But I couldn't pay them with promises. Yet the three who remained stayed on, even when times got tough. That speaks to their loyalty and to how you treat your people. Ross felt a flush of unexpected pleasure at her observation. They're more than employees, he said simply. More like family. Hattie was quiet for a moment, gazing out over the land. I can see why you love it here, she said finally. There's a vastness to it that fills something inside you. Exactly, Ross agreed, surprised and pleased that she understood. My father used to say that some men need walls around them to feel secure. Others need horizon. And you're a horizon man, Hattie said, her eyes meeting his with understanding. Through and through, he confirmed. What about you? Do you miss the walls of Boston? Hattie considered the question. I miss certain things, the libraries, the concerts, the bustle of commerce, but I never felt I quite belonged there, especially after William died. Too many rules about how a widow should behave, what was proper and what wasn't. She gestured to the open land before them. This feels honest somehow. The land doesn't care about social niceties or proper mourning periods. It simply is what it is. Ross nodded, feeling a deepening connection to this unexpected woman. Well said. After lunch, they continued their tour, visiting the horse paddocks where Ross's small breeding program was centered. Pride was evident in his voice as he introduced Hattie to Thunderbolt, the magnificent black stallion at the heart of his operation. He's incredible, Hattie breathed, watching the powerful horse prance along the fence line, showing off for the new visitor. Such presence. He knows it too, Ross laughed. Most intelligent horse I've ever worked with, passing that on to his offspring along with his strength and stamina. How many foals do you expect this season? 5, possibly 6 if that last mare took. It's a small operation compared to some, but I focus on quality over quantity. Each of Thunder's colts sells for at least 3 times the price of an average ranch horse. Hattie nodded approvingly. A wise strategy. Building a reputation for excellence rather than competing on volume. By the time they returned to the main house in late afternoon, Ross found himself genuinely impressed with Hattie's endurance and enthusiasm. Most women of his acquaintance, especially those in their 40s, would have been complaining of saddle soreness after such a long ride. But Hattie seemed energized by the experience. You ride well for someone who claims to be out of practice, he commented as they unsaddled the horses. It comes back to you, she replied, running a brush over Pepper's sweaty coat with practiced motions. Like many things in life, I suppose. Over dinner that evening, Hattie surprised the table by producing a small leather-bound notebook filled with observations and ideas she'd jotted down during their tour. I hope you don't mind, she said, somewhat hesitantly. I've always found writing things down helps me think more clearly. Mind? It's impressive, Ross said, genuinely amazed at the detailed notes she'd taken while also managing a horse and maintaining conversation. I had a few thoughts about potential improvements, Hattie continued, though please tell me if I'm overstepping. This is your ranch, after all. I'd welcome any suggestions, Ross assured her. Fresh eyes often see what the rest of us have grown blind to. Encouraged, Hattie outlined several practical ideas, restructuring the rotation of pastures to allow more recovery time for the grass, expanding the small kitchen garden into a proper vegetable plot to reduce their dependence on purchased supplies, and most intriguingly, investigating the possibility of growing drought-resistant crops on a portion of the less suitable grazing land. My research before coming west suggested that certain varieties of wheat and barley can thrive even in semi-arid conditions, she explained. It would diversify your income sources and provide feed for the livestock during lean times. Ross found himself both impressed and slightly embarrassed that he hadn't considered these options himself. "These are excellent ideas," he admitted, "particularly the crop suggestion. I've been so focused on the cattle and horses that I never really considered alternatives." "It's often difficult to see beyond what we know," Hattie said kindly. "That's why new perspectives can be valuable." After dinner, as had become their routine, Ross and Hattie continued their conversation on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in spectacular colors. "I've been meaning to ask," Ross said after a comfortable silence, "about your children. You mentioned they're grown." Hattie nodded. "My son Robert is 24, running the family business in Boston. He married last year a lovely girl named Catherine. My daughter Elizabeth is 22, teaching at a girls' school in New York. She has her father's mind for figures and my stubborn streak." Pride was evident in her voice. "They didn't object to your coming west." A flicker of something pain perhaps crossed Hattie's face. "They were surprised, certainly. Robert thought I should simply live with him and Catherine, become the devoted grandmother when they start their family." She sighed. "Elizabeth understood better. She said she was proud of me for seeking my own path." "They sound like fine young people," Ross observed. "They are," Hattie agreed. "I miss them naturally, but they have their own lives to build, and She hesitated. "I found I wasn't ready to be relegated to the role of family matriarch, useful only for holiday dinners and childcare." "I can understand that," Ross said. "After my parents died, everyone in town seemed to expect me to either marry quickly or become the perpetual bachelor, dedicated only to the ranch, as if those were the only two options. And yet here you are, attempting a third option," Hattie observed with a small smile. "Here we both are," Ross corrected, returning her smile. As darkness fell completely, the temperature dropped rapidly. Ross noticed Hattie shiver slightly. "Let me walk you back," he offered, rising from his chair. "The nights can get cold quickly out here, even in summer." At the cabin door, their nightly moment of awkwardness seemed less pronounced than before. Ross found himself reluctant to say goodnight. "Thank you for today," Hattie said, echoing her words from the previous evening, "for sharing your land and your vision for it." "Thank you for your insights," Ross replied, "and your company." On impulse, he took her hand and raised it to his lips in a gesture that felt both old-fashioned and perfectly right. "Good night, Hattie." Her eyes widened slightly in surprise, but she didn't pull away. "Good night, Ross," she said softly. As he walked back to the main house under the canopy of stars, Ross found himself contemplating the unexpected turn his life had taken. In just 2 days, Harriet Blackburn had begun to carve out a place for herself on Thornton Ranch, and perhaps in his heart as well. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Mornings began with breakfast shared by the entire household, followed by the day's work. Ross was impressed by Hattie's determination to contribute meaningfully to the ranch operations, despite her limited experience with the physical demands of frontier life. She took over management of the household accounts immediately, bringing order to the haphazard system Ross had maintained since his mother's death. Within a week, she had identified several areas where they could reduce expenses without sacrificing necessities. "You're paying far too much for flour and coffee," she informed Ross, showing him her calculations. If we order in larger quantities directly from Denver rather than through the general store in Julesburg, we could save nearly 20%. Ross was both impressed and slightly chagrined. I never thought to question Hollister's prices, he admitted, referring to the storekeeper in town. Most people don't, Hattie replied. Merchants count on that. No offense to Mr. Hollister, he's running a business, after all, but there's no reason to pay more than necessary for staples. By the end of her first week on the ranch, Hattie had expanded her involvement beyond the house. She took particular interest in the vegetable garden, working alongside Charlie to enlarge it substantially. Her knowledge of plant varieties suited to the climate proved valuable, as she had indeed researched Colorado agriculture before making the journey west. These tomato varieties should produce well into the fall if we protect them on cold nights, she explained to Charlie, who listened with growing respect. And these beans fix nitrogen in the soil, which will help everything else grow better next year. Ross found himself watching their collaboration with amusement and admiration. Charlie, usually territorial about his domain, seemed genuinely pleased to have a knowledgeable partner in his garden efforts. As promised, Hattie also began investigating the possibility of growing grains on a portion of the ranch land. She spent hours poring over agricultural bulletins Ross hadn't even known existed, making notes and sketching out potential field layouts. If we start small, perhaps 10 acres, we can test different varieties without significant risk, she suggested one evening as they sat on the porch. The initial investment would be modest, mainly seed and some additional equipment. It makes good sense, Ross agreed. Diversification would give us more stability. Their evenings together had become something Ross looked forward to throughout the day. As the awkwardness between them faded, their conversations ranged widely from practical ranch matters to books they had read, from childhood memories to broader philosophical questions. One evening, about 2 weeks after Hattie's arrival, Ross found himself sharing more personally than he had in years. They had been discussing a particularly difficult winter several years back, when heavy snows had isolated the ranch for weeks. I never felt so responsible in my life, Ross admitted. My father had just died the previous spring, and there I was, 29 years old, with 4 men and hundreds of animals depending on me to make the right decisions. Mother was still alive then, but growing weaker each day. What did you do? Hattie asked softly. Ross stared into the darkness. The only thing I took it one day at a time. Got up each morning before dawn, checked the livestock, rationed the feed, kept the men's spirits up somehow. When the food supplies started running low, I shot a deer that had wandered too close to the house. Never been so grateful to see an animal in my life. He paused, remembering. The hardest part was watching Mother fade a little more each day, knowing there was nothing I could do. The doctor couldn't get through the snow, but I doubt he could have helped anyway. Her heart was just wearing out, like Pa had taken half of it with him when he died. Hattie's hand found his in the darkness, her touch warm and comforting. You carried a heavy burden alone. Not entirely alone, Ross corrected. Charlie was there, steady as always, and the men. They did their part without complaint. But yes, the decisions were mine to make, for better or worse. Did you ever consider selling? After your mother passed, Ross shook his head firmly. Never seriously. This land, it's in my blood. My father spent his life building this place. Walking away would feel like betraying him somehow. I understand, Hattie said. William, my husband, built our mercantile from nothing. When he died, many suggested I sell it immediately, that a woman couldn't possibly manage such a business. That only made me more determined to keep it going until Robert was ready to take over. Stubbornness seems to be a quality we share, Ross observed with a small smile. I prefer to call it determination, Hattie replied, returning his smile. Their hands remained joined as they sat in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Colorado sky. The next morning brought unexpected news. As they sat at breakfast, Miguel burst into the kitchen, his normally calm demeanor visibly shaken. "Riders coming, boss," he reported. 6, maybe 7 men, armed. Ross stood immediately, his expression hardening. "Caleb with the herd," Miguel nodded. "South pasture." "Stay here," Ross instructed Hattie and Charlie as he moved swiftly to the gun cabinet in the hallway. He removed his Winchester rifle and checked that it was loaded. "I'm coming with you," Hattie said firmly, rising from her chair. Ross opened his mouth to argue, then closed it at the determined look in her eyes. "Stay behind me," he said instead. Outside, they could see the approaching riders, still some distance away but moving steadily toward the ranch house. Ross, Miguel, and Hattie stood on the front porch watching their approach. "Recognize any of them?" Ross asked Miguel quietly. "No, senor," Miguel replied, his own rifle held ready but pointed at the ground. As the riders drew closer, Ross could make out their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache, riding a large chestnut horse. The group stopped about 20 yards from the house, spreading out slightly in a move Ross recognized as tactical. "That's close enough," Ross called out, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "State your business." The leader touched his hat in a gesture that wasn't quite respectful. "Name's Jackson Reed, representing the Western Colorado Land and Cattle Company." Ross's jaw tightened. He'd heard of the company, a large operation backed by Eastern investors, buying up smaller ranches throughout the territory, often using questionable tactics. "What do you want, Reed?" "Just being neighborly," Reed replied with an insincere smile. "Companies acquired the Peterson place to the east and the old Wallace property to the north. Makes us your new neighbors on 2 sides." Ross kept his expression neutral despite his surprise. Old man Peterson had sworn he'd never sell, and the Wallace Ranch had been run by the same family for 3 generations. "Congratulations," Ross said flatly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do." Reed's smile never reached his eyes. "Thing is, Thornton, the company's looking to consolidate holdings in this area. Makes good business sense. I'm authorized to make you a fair offer for this spread." "This ranch isn't for sale," Ross stated firmly. "Not now, not ever." Reed glanced at his companions before returning his gaze to Ross. "Might want to reconsider. Things can get difficult for small operations these days. Water rights disputes, strays crossing property lines, accidental fires." The threat in his words was barely veiled. Ross felt fury building inside him but kept his voice steady. "I think you should leave. Now." To his surprise, Hattie stepped forward, standing beside him. "Mr. Reed, is it?" she said, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I'd like to understand exactly what company you represent." Reed seemed taken aback by her intervention. "Madam, the full legal name of your employer, please, and your title within the organization. I assume you have proper documentation of your authority to negotiate land purchases." Hattie's demeanor had transformed. Suddenly, she was every inch the experienced businesswoman. Reed shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Western Colorado Land and Cattle Company, like I said, based in Denver. And your board of directors." "I'm acquainted with several prominent investors in Denver and Chicago. Perhaps I know your principals." The uncertainty in Reed's expression confirmed Ross's sudden suspicion. The company was likely much less formal and legitimate than Reed was suggesting. "Look, lady, this ain't your concern," Reed began, but Hattie cut him off. On the contrary, Mr. Reed. As Mr. Thornton's wife, any business proposition regarding this ranch is very much my concern. The lie flowed smoothly from her lips, taking Ross by surprise. Now, should you wish to present a proper written offer, with verification of your company's legal standing and financial capabilities, we would be happy to receive it through our attorney in Julesburg. Otherwise, as my husband said, we have work to attend to. Reed's face darkened, but something in Hattie's confident demeanor seemed to give him pause. After a tense moment, he touched his hat again. "We'll be in touch, Mrs. Thornton." With that, he wheeled his horse around and the group rode away, dust rising behind them. As soon as they were out of earshot, Ross turned to Hattie. "My wife?" he asked, one eyebrow raised. A flush crept up Hattie's cheeks. It seemed the quickest way to establish that you weren't alone in this. Men like that prey on those they perceive as vulnerable. Ross couldn't help the grin that spread across his face. "Remind me never to negotiate against you, Mrs. Thornton." Hattie's blush deepened, but she returned his smile. "I may have overstepped. I apologize." "Don't," Ross said, suddenly serious. "You were magnificent." Miguel, who had watched the exchange with interest, nodded in agreement. "La Señora has, how you say, backbone." The threat posed by Reed and his supposed company cast a shadow over the day. After sending Miguel to warn Caleb and instructing both men to be vigilant for any suspicious activity, Ross joined Hattie and Charlie in the kitchen to discuss the situation. "I've heard rumors about operations like this," Ross explained. "They target smaller ranches, use intimidation to force sales at low prices, then consolidate the properties for resale to legitimate investors who don't know how the land was acquired." "Despicable," Hattie commented, "but not surprising. Similar schemes happen in Eastern business circles, just with fewer guns and more lawyers." "What do we do, boss?" Charlie asked. His normally impassive face creased with worry. Ross sighed. "Stay alert. Keep the men close to the house at night. And I should ride into town tomorrow, warn Sheriff Davis about Reed and his men." "I'll come with you," Hattie decided. "I'd like to meet this attorney you supposedly have in Julesburg." Her eyes twinkled despite the serious situation. "About that," Ross said, rubbing the back of his neck. "We don't actually have an attorney." "I suspected as much," Hattie replied. "But Reed doesn't know that, and it might be wise to rectify the situation given the circumstances." The following day, Ross and Hattie rode into Julesburg together. The small town was bustling with its usual mix of local residents, travelers, and cowboys. As they tied their horses in front of the sheriff's office, Ross noticed several townspeople watching with undisguised curiosity. News of his mail-order bride had clearly spread. Sheriff Davis was a grizzled veteran of frontier law enforcement, his weathered face testifying to decades of sun and hard living. He listened attentively as Ross described the visit from Reed and his men. "Can't say I'm surprised," the sheriff said when Ross had finished. "Been hearing similar reports from ranchers to the west. This company moves in, makes trouble, pressures folks to sell." "Is it legal, what they are doing?" Hattie asked. The sheriff shrugged. "Borderline. Making threats is one thing, acting on them is another. Until they actually do something beyond talk, my hands are somewhat tied." "So we just wait for them to burn us out or shoot our cattle?" Ross asked, frustration evident in his voice. "Not saying that," the sheriff clarified. "Just saying I can't arrest them for making vague threats. But I'll keep an eye out. Send deputies to patrol near your place when possible. And if you see them trespassing or catch them in any illegal act, you send word immediately." After leaving the sheriff's office, Ross and Hattie made their way to the office of Howard Jenkins, the only attorney in Julesburg. Jenkins was a young man, perhaps 30, with spectacles and an earnest demeanor that belied his sharp legal mind. Land fraud schemes are increasingly common in the territories, Jenkins confirmed after hearing their story. The lack of clear title records and limited law enforcement makes it fertile ground for such operations. What can we do to protect ourselves? Ross asked. Jenkins considered. Legally, your position is strong. You have clear title to the property, passed down from your father, but practical protection is another matter. He thought for a moment. I would suggest documenting everything any encounters with these men, any suspicious incidents. And it might be wise to formally record Mrs. Thornton's interest in the property as well, to complicate any attempts they might make to pressure you individually. Ross and Hattie exchanged glances. We're not actually married, Ross explained awkwardly. I see, Jenkins said, adjusting his spectacles. Miss Blackburn is my mail-order bride, Ross admitted, though we haven't yet. He trailed off, uncomfortable. We're still getting acquainted, Hattie supplied smoothly. Jenkins nodded. Well, the suggestion stands. Marriage would provide certain legal protections in this situation. But even a formal partnership agreement would establish Miss Blackburn's legitimate interest in the ranch operations. Before leaving town, Ross and Hattie visited the general store to purchase supplies. Mr. Hollister, the proprietor, couldn't conceal his curiosity about Hattie. So you're Thornton's mail-order bride, he said bluntly as he totaled their purchases. Causing quite a stir around town, you are. Is that so, Mr. Hollister? Hattie replied politely. Well, you're not exactly what folks expected, Hollister continued, oblivious to Ross's darkening expression. When word got out that Thornton here had sent for a bride, most figured he'd get some young thing, 20 or so. Mr. Hollister, Ross began warningly, but Hattie laid a gentle hand on his arm. I imagine that would have been the conventional expectation, she agreed pleasantly. But Mr. Thornton is not a conventional man. He specifically sought someone with experience and practical wisdom rather than youth and inexperience. Quite forward-thinking of him, don't you agree? Hollister blinked, momentarily speechless. Well, I suppose that's one way to look at it. It's the only way that matters, Ross stated firmly, counting out payment for their supplies. Good day, Mr. Hollister. Outside the store, Ross turned to Hattie with admiration. You handled that masterfully. Again. Hattie laughed softly. Small-town curiosity is nothing new. My husband's family owned the only mercantile in a small Massachusetts town before we moved to Boston. I learned to navigate nosy neighbors at an early age. As they prepared to mount their horses for the return journey, a woman's voice called out, Mr. Thornton, a moment, please. They turned to see an elegantly dressed woman in her early 30s approaching. Her fashionable attire marked her as someone of means in the small frontier town. Mrs. Harrington, Ross greeted her, touching his hat respectfully. How are you? Very well, thank you, she replied, her curious gaze fixed on Hattie. Won't you introduce me to your companion? Ross performed the introduction. Miss Harriet Blackburn, this is Mrs. Deanna Harrington, wife of the bank president. A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Harrington, Hattie said politely. Likewise, Miss Blackburn, Deanna Harrington replied, studying Hattie with undisguised interest. We've all been quite curious about Mr. Thornton's mail-order bride. You must join us for tea at the Ladies' Aid Society meeting next Tuesday. We gather at the church at 2 o'clock. Ross tensed, expecting Hattie to be offended by the woman's forwardness, but to his surprise, Hattie smiled graciously. That's very kind of you, Mrs. Harrington. If ranch duties permit, I would be delighted to attend. After a few more minutes of polite conversation, primarily consisting of thinly veiled probing questions from Mrs. Harrington, they were finally able to depart. As they rode out of town, Ross glanced at Hattie with newfound respect. "You're remarkably patient with people's curiosity," he observed. Hattie's lips quirked in a small smile. "Years of practice. Besides, it's better to satisfy their curiosity directly than to let rumors flourish unchecked." "Do you really intend to attend their tea party?" "I do, actually," Hattie replied thoughtfully. "Connections in town could prove valuable, especially given our current situation with Mr. Reed and his associates. The wives often know more about local affairs than their husbands realize." Ross shook his head in admiration. "You're quite strategic in your thinking, aren't you?" "I prefer to call it practical," Hattie said with a twinkle in her eye. "Now, tell me more about this Mrs. Harrington. She seemed particularly interested in our arrangement." The ride back to the ranch gave Ross ample time to fill Hattie in on the social dynamics of Julesburg. Deanna Harrington, as the bank president's wife, considered herself the arbiter of local society. Her husband, Gerald Harrington, controlled most of the financial dealings in the county, including the loan on Thornton Ranch. "She's had her eye on me as a potential husband for her younger sister ever since my mother died," Ross admitted ruefully. "Seems to think a confirmed bachelor with a decent property would be a suitable match for a girl fresh from finishing school in St. Louis." "And you disagree?" Hattie asked, her tone carefully neutral. Ross snorted. "I met the sister once. Pretty enough, I suppose, but empty-headed as a new bucket. Couldn't stop talking about the latest fashions in Paris. What would she do on a working ranch, faint at the sight of mud?" Hattie laughed at his description, a warm sound that made Ross smile in response. "Not all young women are so impractical," she pointed out. "My daughter Elizabeth was riding horses and helping in our store from the time she could walk." "Your daughter sounds exceptional," Ross replied. "But I've found that wisdom often comes with experience, not age itself." He glanced at Hattie meaningfully. "Some people gather wisdom throughout their lives. Others remain foolish into old age." The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence as they rode, each absorbed in their own thoughts. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trail, and in the distance, they could see the outlines of Thornton Ranch against the backdrop of the western hills. "It's beautiful," Hattie said softly, following his gaze. "I can see why you love it so much. It grows on you," Ross agreed. "When I was younger, I sometimes dreamed of leaving, seeing more of the world. But now, I can't imagine being anywhere else." As they approached the ranch, however, Ross noticed something that immediately set him on alert. Too much smoke was rising from the direction of the northern pasture. "Something's wrong," he said tersely, spurring his horse into a gallop. Hattie followed without hesitation. They crested the rise to a scene of chaos. The grass in the northern pasture was ablaze, flames spreading rapidly in the dry summer conditions. Caleb and Miguel were working desperately to contain the fire, using wet blankets to beat at the edges of the blaze. Ross and Hattie rode directly to them, dismounting quickly. "What happened?" Ross demanded as he grabbed a blanket from Caleb and began beating at the flames. "Found it like this about 20 minutes ago," Caleb gasped, his face streaked with soot. "Wind's pushing it toward the creek, thank God, not the house." "Any sign of who started it?" Miguel shook his head grimly. "No one saw, but who else but those men from yesterday?" For the next 2 hours, they fought the fire with everything they had. Hattie worked alongside the men without complaint, her face set in determined lines as she beat at flames and carried water from the creek. By the time they finally contained the blaze, the sun was setting and all four were exhausted, covered in ash and sweat. "We saved most of it," Caleb reported, surveying the damage. "Lost maybe 5 acres of good grazing." "Could have been much worse," Ross agreed, his voice hoarse from smoke. He turned to Hattie, concern evident in his eyes. "Are you all right?" she nodded, wiping a smudge of ash from her forehead and succeeding only in spreading it further. "Nothing a bath won't cure, though I fear this dress is beyond salvation." Her attempt at humor, despite the circumstances, touched something deep inside Ross. Without thinking, he reached out and pulled her into a brief, fierce embrace. "Thank you," he said simply as he released her. Not many women would have pitched in like that. Hattie's eyes widened in surprise at the unexpected gesture, but she smiled up at him. Not many would have had the opportunity. "Now, shall we go home and see what Charlie has managed to save for dinner?" The walk back to the ranch was somber, all of them too tired for conversation. Charlie met them at the door, his normally impassive face creased with worry. "Fire out?" he asked anxiously. "Contained," Ross confirmed. "We lost some pasture but no livestock or structures." "Reed's men?" Charlie asked, his expression darkening. "No proof," Ross replied. "But the timing's mighty suspicious." After washing up and changing clothes, they gathered around the dinner table. Despite their exhaustion, they discussed the fire and its implications late into the evening. "We'll need to take turns keeping watch," Ross decided. "At least until we know whether this was a one-time warning or the beginning of a campaign." "I can take a shift," Hattie offered immediately. Ross started to protest, but stopped at the determined look in her eyes. "All right," he conceded, "but not alone. We'll pair up safer that way." Later, as he walked Hattie back to her cabin, Ross found himself reluctant to leave her alone. "I don't like the thought of you out here by yourself, with Reed's men possibly still around." Hattie considered this. "I could move into the main house temporarily," she suggested. "There's that small bedroom off the kitchen that Charlie mentioned was once the housekeeper's room." Relief washed over Ross. "That would ease my mind considerably." "Then it's settled," Hattie said. "I'll gather my things and be over shortly." As Ross waited on the porch of the main house, watching the stars emerge overhead, he reflected on how quickly Harriet Blackburn had become essential to Thornton Ranch and to him. The thought of danger threatening her filled him with a protective fury he hadn't expected. When she returned with her carpet bag and valise, he showed her to the small bedroom. It was plain but clean, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window overlooking the garden. "It's not much," Ross apologized. "Certainly not what you were used to in Boston." "It's perfect," Hattie assured him. "Safe and warm with good people nearby. What more could anyone need?" Impulsively, Ross took her hand. "Hattie, He began, then faltered, uncertain how to express the tumult of emotions inside him. Hattie's eyes softened as she met his gaze. "I know," she said simply. "I feel it too." Gently, Ross raised her hand to his lips. "Good night, Hattie. Sleep well." "Good night, Ross," she replied softly. "And thank you for trusting me today in town and with the fire." "You've more than earned that trust," he said, reluctantly releasing her hand and stepping back. As he made his way upstairs to his own room, Ross found himself contemplating the strange twist of fate that had brought Harriet Blackburn into his life. The mail-order bride might have been older than expected, but with each passing day, it became clearer that she was exactly what he and Thornton Ranch needed. The following days settled into a new routine shaped by the threat from Reed and his men. Everyone on the ranch remained vigilant, with regular patrols of the property boundaries and nightly watches. Ross had ridden back to town to report the fire to Sheriff Davis, who promised to increase patrols in the area, but admitted he had limited resources to spare. Despite the tension, ranch life continued. The daily work of caring for livestock, maintaining buildings, and preparing for the upcoming fall cattle drive couldn't be postponed. If anything, the external threat seemed to solidify the bonds among the small group at Thornton Ranch. Hattie integrated herself fully into ranch operations, dividing her time between household management, garden expansion, and her ongoing research into potential crop cultivation. Her presence in the main house quickly came to feel natural, as if she had always belonged there. Charlie, in particular, seemed pleased with the arrangement, appreciating having someone to talk to during the day's work. True to her word, Hattie attended the Ladies' Aid Society tea the following Tuesday. Ross drove her into town in the wagon, still uneasy about anyone from the ranch traveling alone. "I feel like I'm delivering you to a den of wolves," he joked as they approached the small white church at the edge of town. "I've survived worse," Hattie assured him with a smile. Boston society ladies can be far more vicious than anything Julesburg has to offer. "I'll be at the feed store if you need me," Ross said as he helped her down from the wagon. "The meeting usually lasts about 2 hours, according to what my mother used to say." "I'll find you when it's done," Hattie promised, straightening her best dress, a deep blue affair that brought out the warm tones in her hair and the clarity of her hazel eyes. Ross watched her walk confidently into the church before reluctantly turning toward the feed store. Something about Harriet Blackburn walking away from him always made him want to follow. Inside the church, Hattie found about 15 women gathered in the small meeting room. Conversation halted momentarily as she entered, all eyes turning to assess the newcomer. Deanna Harrington rose immediately, gliding forward with practiced grace. "Miss Blackburn, how delightful that you could join us," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Ladies, this is Miss Harriet Blackburn, who has recently arrived from Boston to keep house for Mr. Thornton." The slight pause spoke volumes. Hattie maintained her pleasant expression, though she noted the deliberate omission of her status as Ross's intended. "Thank you for the invitation, Mrs. Harrington. It's a pleasure to meet you all." The next 2 hours proved to be an exercise in diplomatic navigation. The women's curiosity about her relationship with Ross was thinly veiled beneath discussions of church fundraisers and community needs. Hattie answered their questions with calm politeness, neither confirming nor denying their assumptions about her arrangement with Ross. "And will there be a wedding soon?" asked Mrs. Peterson, a plump, friendly woman who seemed less judgmental than some of the others. "Mr. Thornton and I are still becoming acquainted," Hattie replied diplomatically. "We both believe in building a solid foundation before making such commitments." "Very sensible," commented an older woman whom Hattie had been introduced to as Mrs. Campbell, the minister's wife. "Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, particularly in frontier conditions." Throughout the gathering, Hattie found herself drawing on years of experience navigating complicated social situations. By the end of the meeting, she had identified potential allies among the women, gained useful information about local dynamics, and even managed to steer the conversation toward the suspicious activities of Reed's supposed company. "My Gerald mentioned something about that operation," Deanna Harrington admitted when Hattie raised the subject. "He said they've been approaching the bank about financing local land acquisitions, quite aggressive in their plans, apparently. Has your husband verified their financial backing?" Hattie asked innocently. "I understand such operations sometimes misrepresent their capitalization." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Deanna's perfect features. "I couldn't say. Gerald doesn't discuss the details of bank business with me." "Of course," Hattie agreed smoothly. "Though I've heard concerning reports from other territories about similar operations using intimidation to force sales, then leaving investors holding worthless paper. Very troubling for legitimate financial institutions that might be unknowingly involved." She noticed several of the women exchanging glances, and Mrs. Campbell nodding thoughtfully. The seed had been planted. As the meeting concluded, Hattie found herself genuinely invited to return the following week, this time by Mrs. Campbell, rather than the more calculating Mrs. Harrington. "You bring a fresh perspective, my dear," the minister's wife said warmly. "And we can always use more practical minds in our little group." When Ross collected her from the church steps, he could tell from her satisfied expression that the meeting had gone well. Successful reconnaissance? He asked as he helped her into the wagon. "Very," Hattie confirmed. "I've learned that Reed's company has approached the bank about financing, and I may have planted some seeds of doubt about their legitimacy." Ross shook his head in admiration. "Remind me never to play poker against you." "I'm terrible at poker," Hattie laughed. "My face gives everything away. This is different. It's about understanding what people value and how they perceive their own interests." As they drove back toward the ranch, Ross found himself contemplating the ease with which he and Hattie had fallen into partnership. It felt natural to discuss problems together, to value her insights, to face challenges as a team. "I've been thinking," he said after a comfortable silence, "about what Jenkins said regarding legal protections." Hattie glanced at him, her expression carefully neutral. "Oh, the partnership agreement he suggested," Ross clarified, suddenly feeling awkward. "It might be wise, given the situation with Reed. To formalize your stake in the ranch operations, I mean." He was making a mess of this, he realized. "I see," Hattie said, a hint of something unreadable in her voice. "Yes, that would be a practical step." "Of course, there's the other option he mentioned," Ross continued, staring straight ahead at the road. "Marriage would provide even stronger legal protection." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Finally, Hattie spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Are you proposing Ross Thornton?" Ross pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her directly. "I'm doing a poor job of it if you have to ask," he said with a rueful smile. Then more seriously, "Yes, Hattie, I am. Not just for legal protection, though that's part of it. These past weeks, you've brought something to the ranch and to my life that I didn't even know was missing." Hattie's eyes widened, a flush spreading across her cheeks. "Ross, are you certain? I'm still not the young bride most men would want." "I'm not most men," Ross replied firmly. "And I thank God every day that you weren't the young bride I thought I wanted." He reached for her hand. "You're exactly what I need, Harriet Blackburn, a partner with wisdom, courage, and determination. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to call you my wife." Tears glistened in Hattie's eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Ross Thornton." The joy that surged through Ross at her acceptance took him by surprise with its intensity. Without hesitation, he leaned forward and kissed her, a gentle, questioning kiss that quickly deepened as Hattie responded with unexpected passion. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Ross pressed his forehead to hers. "Well, Mrs. Thornton-to-be, shall we continue home and share our news?" Hattie laughed, the sound pure happiness. "Yes, let's, though I suspect Charlie won't be the least bit surprised." The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the small Julesburg church, with Reverend Campbell officiating. The brief engagement period was partly practical given the threat from Reed's men. Securing legal protection seemed prudent, but also reflected the certainty both Ross and Hattie felt about their decision. The ceremony was simple, but meaningful. Charlie served as Ross's best man, beaming with approval throughout the proceedings. Mrs. Campbell stood as Hattie's matron of honor, having quickly become a trusted friend during Hattie's visits to town. Caleb and Miguel sat in the front pew, both uncomfortable in their Sunday best, but determined to show their support. To Ross's surprise, a significant portion of the town turned out for the ceremony. Whether motivated by genuine goodwill or simple curiosity, Their presence filled the small church to capacity. Even Deanna Harrington attended, though her smile seemed somewhat fixed as she wished the couple well. Hattie wore a simple gown of ivory silk that she had brought with her from Boston, explaining that it had been her second-best dress for social occasions. With a few alterations made over late-night sewing sessions with Mrs. Campbell, it became a perfectly suitable wedding dress. Her hair was arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck, with a few tendrils softening her face. To Ross, she had never looked more beautiful. "I, Ross, take thee, Harriet, to be my wedded wife," he vowed, his voice steady despite the emotion tightening his chest. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." Hattie's eyes shone with unshed tears as she repeated her own vows, her voice clear and confident. When Reverend Campbell pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was brief but tender, mindful of their audience yet unmistakably heartfelt. The small reception that followed at the town hall was a lively affair. Charlie had outdone himself preparing food, and several of the church ladies had contributed dishes as well. Even Sheriff Davis made an appearance, offering his congratulations and quietly assuring Ross that his deputies were keeping a close eye on the ranch during their absence. "No sign of Reed or his men since the fire," the sheriff reported, "but that doesn't mean they've given up. We'll remain vigilant," Ross promised. "And thank you for watching over the place today." As the celebration continued, Ross found a moment to pull Hattie aside, into a quiet corner away from the well-wishers. "Happy, Mrs. Thornton?" he asked softly, still marveling at the reality of their union. "Very," she confirmed, her smile radiant. "Though I must admit, this is not how I imagined my life unfolding when I boarded that train in Boston." "Any regrets?" Ross asked, a hint of vulnerability in his question. Hattie shook her head decisively. "Not one. You?" "Only that I wasted so many years alone before finding you," he replied, raising her hand to his lips. Their moment of privacy was interrupted by Charlie, who approached with a telegram in hand. "This come for Mrs. Thornton," he announced, using Hattie's new title with evident satisfaction. "Boy bring it from station just now." Hattie accepted the telegram with surprise, quickly opening it. As she read, her expression transformed from curiosity to delight. "It's from my children," she explained, looking up at Ross with shining eyes. "Robert and Elizabeth, they're coming to visit. They'll be on the train arriving 2 weeks from today." "That's wonderful news," Ross said sincerely, though he couldn't help a flicker of apprehension at the thought of meeting Hattie's grown children. Would they approve of their mother's decision? Would they accept him as her husband? Hattie seemed to read his thoughts. "They'll love you," she assured him, squeezing his hand. "How could they not? You've made me happier than I've been in years." As the reception wound down and they prepared to return to the ranch, Ross found himself reflecting on the extraordinary turn his life had taken in just a few short weeks. The mail-order bride who had stepped off the train older than he'd expected, but exactly what he needed, had transformed not only his home but his heart as well. That night, as husband and wife retired to the master bedroom, now their shared domain, Ross took Hattie in his arms with a mixture of desire and tenderness that surprised even him. "I never thought I'd find this," he confessed as they lay together in the darkness, her head resting on his shoulder. "Not just a wife, but a true partner." "Nor I," Hattie admitted softly. "After William died, I assumed that part of my life was over. I came west seeking purpose, not love, and found both," Ross said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Found both," she agreed, nestling closer into his embrace. The following days were a blissful adjustment to married life, despite the shadow of Reed's threat still hanging over the ranch. Ross and Hattie quickly established new routines, working together during the day and sharing quiet evenings on the porch or by the fire. The physical intimacy of marriage came naturally to them, a sweet discovery that deepened their connection with each passing night. Preparations for the arrival of Hattie's children occupied much of their attention. The second bedroom, unused since Ross's sister's death, was cleaned and made ready for Elizabeth. Robert would stay in the now vacant foreman's cabin. Hattie threw herself into planning, determined that her children's first impression of their new home would be positive. "Do you think they'll be shocked?" she asked Ross one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Finding their mother married to a rancher in Colorado, Ross considered the question. "Surprised, certainly, but shocked. I hope not. You've written to explain the situation, haven't you?" "Yes, though there's only so much one can convey in a telegram or letter," Hattie sighed. "Elizabeth will adapt quickly, I think. She's always been adventurous. Robert is more traditional, more protective of me since his father died." "Understandable," Ross said. "But he'll see that you're happy here. That matters." "It does," Hattie agreed. "And they'll see what we're building together, not just a marriage, but the future of this ranch." The plans for crop diversification that Hattie had researched were moving forward. Ross had dedicated 10 acres of the less suitable grazing land for an experimental planting of winter wheat, to be sown after the first frost. The expanded garden was already producing abundantly, with preserving and canning occupying many of Hattie's afternoons. Most significantly, Ross had begun implementing Hattie's suggested reorganization of the cattle operation, focusing on selective breeding to improve the quality of the herd rather than simply increasing numbers. It was a longer-term strategy, but one that promised greater stability and profit over time. "I've been thinking," Ross said, breaking a comfortable silence, "about the house." "Oh," Hattie turned to him, curious. "It's a good, solid home, but it shows its age." "I've been making repairs as needed, but maybe it's time for some real improvements." He gestured toward the structure behind them. "A proper kitchen with modern conveniences, maybe indoor plumbing, at least for a bathroom, and the front porch could use rebuilding." Hattie's eyes widened. "That sounds like quite an undertaking, and expensive." "It would be," Ross acknowledged. "But if we're going to grow this ranch, make it something to pass on to the next generation, the house should grow too." The implication of his words hung in the air between them. At 43, Hattie had assumed her childbearing years were behind her, though it wasn't impossible that she might still conceive. They hadn't discussed children of their own, focusing instead on the immediate challenges facing the ranch. "The next generation," she echoed softly. Ross took her hand. "I know it might not be children of our own," he said gently, "though I wouldn't be opposed to that miracle if it happened. But your children, their children someday. I'd like to think of Thornton Ranch continuing, whoever carries the name forward." Tears glistened in Hattie's eyes. "I'd like that too," she whispered. The tender moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Ross was instantly alert, rising to his feet and reaching for the rifle that now stayed constantly near the front door. "Stay here," he instructed Hattie, though he knew the order was likely futile. Sure enough, she stood as well, moving to his side as they peered into the gathering darkness. The rider came into view, one of Sheriff Davis's deputies, riding hard. He reined in his lathered horse as he reached the house. "Mr. Thornton," he called, dismounting quickly. "Sheriff sent me. There's trouble in town." "What kind of trouble?" Ross demanded, lowering the rifle but keeping it ready. "Reid and his men," the deputy explained, catching his breath. "They're at the bank. Sheriff thinks they're pressuring Harrington to call in loans on properties they're targeting." "Including ours," Hattie asked sharply. The deputy nodded grimly. Your name specifically came up, according to our informant at the saloon. Reed was buying drinks, talking loudly about how Thornton Ranch would be part of their holdings before winter. Ross felt cold fury building inside him. When did this happen? They're there now, the deputy said. Sheriff's gathered some men, but he wanted to warn you and ask if you could come. Thought having the property owners present might help Harrington stand firm. Ross turned to Hattie, conflict evident in his expression. He didn't want to leave her, but the threat to the ranch couldn't be ignored. Go, she said firmly, reading his thoughts, but I'm coming with you. We face this together. For a moment, Ross considered arguing, but the determination in his wife's eyes told him it would be futile. Besides, she was right, they were partners now in all things. We'll both go, he decided. Miguel and Caleb can watch the ranch. He turned to the deputy. Give us 10 minutes to get ready and inform our men. 30 minutes later, they were riding hard toward Julesburg, the deputy leading the way. Ross had insisted Hattie change into her split riding skirt for easier travel at speed. The night was clear, a 3/4 moon providing enough light to navigate safely. Whatever happens, Ross said as they rode, stay close to me or Sheriff Davis. Reed's men might be drunk and dangerous. I'm not afraid, Hattie replied, though her expression was grave. This is our home, our future. We'll defend it together. They reached Julesburg to find the small town in unusual turmoil for the late hour. Lights blazed from the bank building, and a crowd had gathered outside. Sheriff Davis stood on the steps, his deputies positioned strategically around the building. Through the windows, they could see several men inside, including Reed's unmistakable broad-shouldered figure. Thornton, Sheriff Davis greeted them as they dismounted. Mrs. Thornton, thank you for coming. What's the situation? Ross asked tersely. Reed and 3 of his men are inside with Harrington. They've been there about an hour. From what I can gather, they're trying to pressure him to call in your loan, along with those of 2 other ranchers who have refused to sell. On what grounds? Hattie demanded. Our payments have been timely and in full. Doesn't matter if Harrington decides the loan is at risk, the sheriff explained grimly. The terms give him some discretion. Reed is likely offering to take the properties off the bank's hands, probably at pennies on the dollar. That's outrageous, Hattie exclaimed. It would never stand up in court. By the time it got to court, the damage would be done, Ross pointed out. We need to stop this now. At that moment, the bank door opened, and Gerald Harrington appeared, looking pale and harassed. Reed loomed behind him, a hand on the banker's shoulder in what only appeared to be a friendly gesture. Sheriff, Harrington called, his voice strained. There's no need for all this. Just a business meeting running late. Doesn't look like just business to me, Gerald, Sheriff Davis replied steadily. Why don't you step outside and we can discuss this properly? Reed's grip on Harrington's shoulder visibly tightened. Mr. Harrington and I have nearly concluded our arrangements, he said smoothly. Perhaps tomorrow would be a better time for community discussions. I think now is just fine, Ross stated, stepping forward. Especially since you're discussing my property. Reed's expression hardened as he recognized Ross and Hattie. Thornton, this doesn't concern you. My loan with this bank most certainly concerns me, Ross countered. As does your attempt to manipulate Mr. Harrington into fraudulent actions. Harrington winced, glancing between Ross and Reed with growing distress. Now, Mr. Thornton, no one is suggesting anything fraudulent, aren't they? Hattie interjected, stepping to Ross's side. Mr. Harrington, we understand that Mr. Reed here has been suggesting you call in our loan despite our perfect payment history. On what legitimate banking grounds would you make such a decision? The crowd murmured, and Harrington's discomfort visibly increased. Deanna Harrington had pushed through to the front of the onlookers, her face a mask of concern as she watched her husband. "Gerald," she called, "what is going on? What are these men asking you to do?" Reed scowled at the growing complications. "This is a private business matter, not anymore," Sheriff Davis interrupted. "Not when you bring armed men into our town and intimidate our bank president after hours." He gestured to the gun belts visible on Reed's companions inside the bank. The standoff might have continued, but at that moment, an unexpected voice rang out from the crowd. "Gerald Harrington, if you dishonor this bank and this town with corrupt dealings, I will personally ensure that every depositor withdraws their funds by noon tomorrow." All heads turned to see Mrs. Campbell, the minister's wife, standing resolute beside her husband. The respected couple's presence seemed to shift something in the atmosphere. "The Reverend and I have known Ross Thornton since he was a boy," Mrs. Campbell continued, her voice carrying clearly. "And while we've only recently had the pleasure of meeting Mrs. Thornton, we recognize decent, hard-working people when we see them. Whatever these men are offering you, Gerald, it's not worth your reputation or the trust of this community." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Harrington looked increasingly trapped, glancing between Reed's darkening face and the resolute expressions of his neighbors. "Gerald," Deanna Harrington said, her voice softer but no less firm, "come out of there. Whatever decision needs making about loans can be done in the light of day, with proper consideration." It was the final push Harrington needed. With a sudden movement, he pulled away from Reed's grip and stepped out onto the bank steps, moving quickly to his wife's side. "I think this meeting is adjourned, Mr. Reed," he said, finding his courage at last. "The bank will not be calling in any loans that are in good standing. Any future business between your company and this bank will be conducted during regular hours, with proper documentation of your financial backing." Reed's face contorted with fury, but he was astute enough to recognize the turning tide. With the sheriff, his deputies, and now a significant portion of the townspeople aligned against him, his position had become untenable. "You'll regret this, Harrington," he snarled. "All of you will." His gaze fixed on Ross and Hattie with particular venom. "Is that a threat, Reed?" Sheriff Davis asked mildly, his hand dropping casually to his sidearm. After a tense moment, Reed forced a cold smile. "Just a prediction, Sheriff. Business has its ups and downs." He gestured to his men. "Come on, boys. Seems Julesburg isn't as forward-thinking as we'd hoped." As Reed and his men filed out of the bank, the sheriff and his deputies formed a corridor, clearly intending to escort them out of town. The crowd parted, watching silently as the group moved toward the hitching posts where their horses waited. Ross kept Hattie close as they observed Reed's departure. The danger wasn't over, he knew. Men like Reed didn't give up easily on their schemes. "This isn't finished," he murmured to Hattie. "No," she agreed quietly, "but tonight was a victory. We've shown them that Julesburg stands together." Indeed, the sense of community solidarity was palpable as the townspeople gathered in small groups, discussing the evening's events. Several approached Ross and Hattie to express support, including the Campbells and, somewhat surprisingly, the Harringtons. "I apologize for my momentary weakness," Gerald Harrington said stiffly. Reed's proposals were persuasive and his methods of persuasion increasingly forceful. "We understand," Hattie replied diplomatically. "Such men excel at creating pressure and isolation. That's why community is our best defense against them." Deanna Harrington studied Hattie with new respect. "You handled yourself admirably tonight, Mrs. Thornton. We're fortunate to have someone with your perspective in our community." It was as close to approval as the proud woman was likely to give. and Hattie accepted it with a gracious nod. As the excitement gradually subsided and people began returning to their homes, Sheriff Davis approached Ross and Hattie. "I've sent my men to escort Reed and his associates well beyond the town limits," he reported. "But I'd advise caution. Men like that don't take public humiliation lightly." "We'll be vigilant," Ross assured him, "and grateful for any extra patrols you can spare near our property." "I'll do what I can," the sheriff promised. "And I've sent word to the territorial marshal about this outfit. With luck, they'll find the legal grounds to run Reed and his kind out of Colorado altogether." It was past midnight by the time Ross and Hattie began their ride back to the ranch, accompanied by two of the sheriff's deputies as a precaution. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving both of them tired but satisfied with the night's outcome. "You were magnificent," Ross told Hattie as they rode side by side under the moonlight. "The way you questioned Harrington about legitimate banking grounds, I thought he might faint on the spot." Hattie laughed softly. "Banking may have changed since my days helping William with the mercantile accounts, but certain principles remain the same. Loans in good standing aren't called in without cause, not by reputable institutions, at least." "Still, your confidence in challenging him made all the difference," Ross insisted. "You have a way of cutting to the heart of matters that's quite remarkable." "A benefit of age and experience, perhaps," Hattie replied with a hint of teasing. "As you once observed, wisdom often accompanies years." "The wisest decision I ever made was accepting you as my bride," Ross said, his tone turning serious. "Mail order or otherwise." The deputies tactfully rode a few paces ahead, giving them the illusion of privacy as they continued their journey. The night was peaceful, stars scattered across the vast Colorado sky like diamond dust. "You think Reed will try again?" Hattie asked after a comfortable silence. "Almost certainly," Ross replied honestly. "Men like that don't surrender easily. But we've bought time and we've shown them that we're not isolated or vulnerable. That matters. And we've made allies in town," Hattie added thoughtfully. "More than I expected, honestly." "People respect strength and principle," Ross said. "You've shown both since arriving. And despite initial curiosity about our arrangement, I think the community has come to see what I saw, that your character is what matters, not conventional expectations." As they crested the final rise before Thornton Ranch came into view, they could see lanterns burning at the house and bunkhouse. Miguel and Caleb keeping vigil, awaiting their return. "Home," Hattie said softly, the single word filled with emotion. Ross reached across to take her hand, squeezing it gently. "Home," he agreed, "for today, tomorrow, and all the days to come." The weeks that followed brought both challenges and joys to Thornton Ranch. True to Ross's prediction, Reed did not abandon his schemes entirely, though the public confrontation at the bank had forced him to adopt more subtle tactics. Reports reached them of similar operations being disrupted in neighboring counties, suggesting that the territorial authorities were beginning to take notice of the fraudulent land schemes. Meanwhile, life on the ranch continued its seasonal rhythms. Preparations for the fall cattle drive to Cheyenne intensified, with Ross spending long days working with the herd, ensuring the animals were in prime condition for the journey and subsequent sale. The drive would be crucial for the ranch's finances, potentially clearing half of the remaining bank loan if prices held as expected. Hattie divided her time between household management, garden harvesting, and overseeing the preparation of the experimental wheat field. Her research had identified a hardy winter variety that might thrive in Colorado's challenging conditions, and Ross had allocated resources for the attempt, recognizing the potential long-term benefits of diversification. The arrival of Hattie's children brought a new dimension to their lives. Robert and Elizabeth Blackburn stepped off the Julesburg train with a mixture of curiosity and reservation visible on their faces. Robert, at 24, bore a striking resemblance to the portrait of William that Hattie kept in their bedroom, tall and broad-shouldered, with the same serious expression and thoughtful eyes. Elizabeth, 2 years younger, had her mother's auburn hair and direct gaze, though her features were finer, her manner more openly animated. Their initial meeting was awkward but heartfelt. Ross had insisted on accompanying Hattie to town to meet the train, determined to make a good first impression on his new stepchildren despite his nervousness. "Mother," Elizabeth cried, rushing forward to embrace Hattie as soon as she spotted her on the platform. "You look wonderful, so vibrant." "Marriage agrees with her," Robert observed more reservedly, though his smile for his mother was genuine as he stepped forward for his own embrace. "Children, I'd like you to meet my husband, Ross Thornton," Hattie said, drawing Ross forward with evident pride. "Ross, my son Robert, and my daughter Elizabeth." Ross extended his hand to Robert, meeting the young man's assessing gaze directly. "Welcome to Colorado, Robert. I'm very glad to meet you." After a moment's hesitation, Robert shook the offered hand firmly. "Mr. Thornton, thank you for having us." Elizabeth proved less formal, stepping forward with a warm smile. "So you're the rancher who swept Mother off her feet. I've been dying to meet you." "Elizabeth," Hattie chided gently, though her eyes sparkled with amusement. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Elizabeth," Ross replied, charmed by her directness. "And I think it was your mother who did the sweeping, to be honest." This earned him a genuine laugh from Elizabeth and a softening in Robert's expression. The ice wasn't completely broken, but it was a start. The journey back to the ranch provided opportunity for initial conversations, with Elizabeth asking eager questions about ranch life while Robert observed more quietly, occasionally interjecting with more practical inquiries about the operation's size and management. "And you've been here since childhood?" Elizabeth asked Ross. "How fascinating. I've never known anyone who's lived their entire life in one place." "Not quite my entire life," Ross corrected. "I spent 2 years at school in Denver at my mother's insistence. But yes, this land has been my home for as long as I can remember." "It must be gratifying to build on your father's legacy," Robert commented, his first voluntary contribution to the conversation. Ross glanced at the young man with increased respect. "It is," he agreed. "Though not without its challenges. A legacy is both a gift and a responsibility." "Indeed," Robert said, meeting Ross's gaze with new understanding. "I feel the same about my father's business." By the time they reached the ranch, the atmosphere had warmed considerably. Charlie had prepared a welcome feast, and Caleb and Miguel had ensured the property looked its best. The pride that Ross and Hattie took in their home was evident, and gradually, both Robert and Elizabeth seemed to respond to their enthusiasm. Over the following days, the young Blackburns integrated into ranch life with varying degrees of adaptation. Elizabeth threw herself into the experience with characteristic enthusiasm, insisting on learning to ride properly and accompanying Ross on his morning rounds whenever possible. Her natural affinity for horses surprised and delighted Ross, creating a bond between them that bridged their initial unfamiliarity. Robert proved more reserved but no less observant. He spent time studying the ranch's financial records with the eye of an experienced businessman, eventually approaching Ross with thoughtful questions, and even a few suggestions regarding market strategies for the upcoming cattle sale. "You've maintained remarkably comprehensive records," he commented one evening as they sat in the study, ledgers spread before them. "Most operations this size don't track expenses with such detail." My mother's influence, Ross explained. She believed in education and proper accounting with equal fervor. Said a man might be the finest horseman or cattleman alive, but without knowing his true costs and revenues, he'd still fail in the end. A wise woman, Robert observed. Your diversification plans are sound as well. Crop rotation alongside cattle production provides stability against market fluctuations and natural disasters alike. That particular wisdom comes from your mother, Ross admitted. She arrived with more practical ideas in a month than I'd considered in years. Robert studied Ross thoughtfully. She seems happy here, he said after a moment. Happier than I've seen her since Father died. I hope she is, Ross replied seriously. Her happiness matters a great deal to me. I can see that, Robert acknowledged. I'll admit I was concerned when I received her letters about this arrangement. It seemed hasty, potentially reckless. Understandable, Ross said. In your position, I'd have had the same concerns. But seeing her here with you. Robert hesitated, then continued with evident sincerity. I believe she's found her place, and for that, you have my gratitude and respect. The moment marked a turning point in their relationship, an acceptance that transcended the awkwardness of their situation. Ross felt a weight lift that he hadn't fully acknowledged. Was there the approval of Hattie's children mattered more than he had realized? The visit, initially planned for 2 weeks, extended to nearly a month as both Robert and Elizabeth found themselves reluctant to leave. The harvest season was in full swing, with garden vegetables being preserved for winter and the experimental wheat field being prepared for planting. The cattle drive loomed on the horizon, occupying much of Ross's attention as he finalized preparations and arrangements. One evening, as they sat on the porch enjoying the cooling temperatures of early fall, Hattie broached a subject that had clearly been on her mind. "Elizabeth," she began, "I couldn't help noticing your enthusiasm for ranch life. You seem to have taken to it with remarkable ease." Elizabeth smiled, her eyes alight with the passion of youth. "It's wonderful, Mother, so different from Boston or New York. There's a realness to it that I find exhilarating." Hattie exchanged a glance with Ross before continuing. "Would you consider staying longer, perhaps through the winter? Ross could use help with the books and correspondence while he's away on the cattle drive, and I'd welcome another pair of hands for the household and garden work." Elizabeth's face lit up with undisguised delight. "Do you mean it? I'd love to stay. My position at the school isn't due to resume until spring term anyway. I'd only planned to visit friends in New York in the interim." "What about you, Robert?" Ross asked. "Would your business permit a longer absence?" Robert shook his head regretfully. "I need to return. The fall shipments will be arriving, and while my manager is capable, there are decisions that require my attention." He smiled at his sister. "Besides, someone should let Boston society know that Elizabeth hasn't been kidnapped by wild cowboys." "Just the one cowboy," Elizabeth teased, gesturing at Ross. "And he's already spoken for." The easy laughter that followed warmed Ross's heart. This blended family was finding its rhythm, creating new bonds while honoring old ones. Hattie caught his eye across the porch, her expression one of pure contentment, and Ross felt a surge of gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought this unexpected woman into his life. The night before Robert's departure, and the beginning of the cattle drive, brought a quiet celebration. Charlie outdid himself with a farewell dinner that showcased the best of the ranch's produce. And even Miguel and Caleb joined them at the table, their initial awkwardness around the Eastern folks having long since faded. After dinner, Robert drew Ross aside for a private word. "I've been thinking about your operation here," he began, his tone businesslike but friendly. The Mercantile in Boston has connections with several quality goods suppliers that might be of interest for your ranch needs. Better prices than you're currently paying, if my analysis is correct. Ross raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Go on. I'm proposing a business arrangement, Robert continued. Not charity or family favor, but a mutually beneficial trading relationship. You need supplies. We need reliable sources for certain Western goods that sell well in Boston, handcrafted leather items, certain regional foodstuffs, perhaps even some of your specialized horse breeding stock eventually. A transcontinental partnership, Ross mused, impressed by the young man's vision. It has merit. Consider it while you're on the drive, Robert suggested. We can correspond about specifics when you return. I think it could benefit both our operations substantially. The offer represented more than a business proposition, Ross knew. It was Robert's way of acknowledging and accepting the new family connection, offering integration rather than separation between their worlds. I'll consider it seriously, Ross promised. And I appreciate the spirit in which it's offered. The following dawn broke clear and cool, perfect weather for beginning the cattle drive. The herd of 300 head was gathered in the south pasture, ready for the journey to Cheyenne. Caleb and Miguel, along with 3 temporary hands hired for the drive, had everything in readiness. Goodbyes were bittersweet. Robert would take the eastbound train that afternoon, beginning his long journey back to Boston. Ross would be gone for at least 3 weeks on the cattle drive, leaving Hattie and Elizabeth to manage the ranch in his absence. Be careful, Hattie murmured as she embraced Ross beside his saddled horse. Remember that you have more than the ranch waiting for your return now. I'll remember, Ross promised, holding her close. Take care of each other, and stay vigilant. Reed may see my absence as an opportunity. We will, Hattie assured him. Sheriff Davis has promised to check in regularly, and Charlie is surprisingly handy with that old shotgun of his. Ross kissed her once more before mounting his horse. As he rode toward the waiting herd, he glanced back at the scene before him, his wife and stepdaughter standing together on the porch, Charlie nearby, with Robert preparing for their trip to town. The image of home and family burned itself into his memory, a talisman to carry through the long days ahead. The cattle drive proved arduous but successful. Fall weather cooperated for the most part, though 2 days of heavy rain created challenging conditions as they drove the herd through muddy terrain. The men worked well together, with Caleb showing increasing leadership abilities as Ross's right-hand man. Arriving in Cheyenne, Ross found the cattle market strong, with prices even better than he had anticipated. The quality of the Thornton herd drew favorable attention from buyers, resulting in a sale that exceeded Ross's most optimistic projections. After settling accounts and paying the drovers their shares, he found himself with enough capital to clear well over half of the remaining bank loan, a significant step toward the ranch's financial security. Throughout the journey, Ross's thoughts frequently returned to Thornton Ranch, to Hattie's practical wisdom and warm embrace, to the unexpected joy of Elizabeth's continued presence in their home, to the promising connection established with Robert. The solitary life he had led for so many years now seemed distant and incomplete compared to the richness he had found with his mail-order bride and her children. The return journey was made with lighter hearts and heavier pockets. As they approached the familiar landscape of home, Ross felt anticipation building within him. 3 weeks had never seemed so long. Cresting the final rise that overlooked the ranch, Ross reined in his horse, savoring the view. Smoke rose peacefully from the chimney of the main house, and even from this distance, he could see the vibrant autumn colors of the expanded garden. Everything looked peaceful, undisturbed. As he rode into the yard, the front door burst open and Hattie emerged, her face alight with welcome. Behind her came Elizabeth, equally enthusiastic. Even Charlie appeared on the porch, his usually stoic expression softening into a smile. Ross dismounted quickly, catching Hattie in a fierce embrace as she reached him. "Welcome home," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "We've missed you terribly." "Not as much as I've missed you," Ross replied, drinking in the sight of her beloved face. "All of you," he added, including Elizabeth in his gaze. That evening, after the initial excitement of reunion had settled into comfortable conversation, Ross shared the financial success of the cattle sale. The amount he placed on the dining table, the remainder after the bank payment had been made, represented financial security, such as the ranch hadn't known in years. "This changes everything," Hattie said, her eyes wide as she grasped the implications. The improvements to the house, the expansion of the crop experiment, perhaps even hiring another permanent hand. "All possible now," Ross agreed, "but there's something else I want to discuss first." He turned to Elizabeth, who had been listening with interest. "Your mother mentioned that you've been considering your future plans, that teaching position in New York." Elizabeth nodded, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her expressive face. "Yes, though I've grown so attached to the ranch, I'm finding the idea of returning east less appealing by the day." "What would you say to a more permanent role here?" Ross asked. "Not just as family, but as a contributing partner in the operation. Your education background would be valuable as we expand the record-keeping systems, and your way with the horses is genuinely impressive." Elizabeth's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "You'd want me to stay?" "Very serious," Ross confirmed. "Your mother and I have discussed it at length. This place is large enough to support extended family working together, particularly as we diversify. And frankly, you've shown a natural aptitude for ranch life that would be a shame to waste." "What about my teaching?" Elizabeth asked, though her expression revealed her growing excitement. "Julesburg is growing," Hattie pointed out. "The school is currently seeking an additional teacher for the spring term. It wouldn't be the same as your position in New York, but it would allow you to continue your profession while also being part of the ranch." "You've thought of everything," Elizabeth marveled. I don't know what to say except yes. Yes, I'd love to stay to be part of this." Impulsively, she jumped up to embrace both Ross and her mother. "Thank you for wanting me." "You've earned your place here," Ross said simply, "just as your mother did." Later that night, as Ross and Hattie prepared for bed in the privacy of their room, he shared the full extent of his plans for the ranch's future. "With the loan nearly cleared and the successful cattle sale behind us, we're in a position to make real changes," he explained. "The house improvements we discussed earlier, for one, and expanding the experimental crop area if this first planting proves successful. The partnership Robert proposed, have you given it more thought?" Hattie asked as she brushed out her hair, a nightly ritual Ross had come to cherish watching. "I have," he confirmed. "It makes good business sense and it would strengthen the family connection as well. I'll write to him tomorrow with a formal acceptance and some specific proposals." Hattie set down her brush and turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "When I boarded that train in Boston, I never imagined any of this," she admitted. "At most, I hoped for a useful role, perhaps some companionship in my later years. The idea that I might find true love, that my children might become part of this new life. It seemed impossible. And yet here we are," Ross said softly, drawing her into his arms. "All because you were older than expected, and I was wise enough to recognize that was exactly what I needed." "Wisdom comes in many forms," Hattie murmured against his chest. sometimes in recognizing value where others might see only age, sometimes in taking a chance on a stranger who turns out to be your perfect match, Ross countered, tilting her face up for a kiss. As winter settled over Thornton Ranch, the household fell into new rhythms that reflected the expanded family circle. Elizabeth secured the teaching position in Julesburg, riding into town 3 days a week and devoting the remainder of her time to learning ranch operations. The experimental wheat field showed promising early growth before winter dormancy, validating Hattie's research and Ross's willingness to diversify. Correspondence with Robert became regular, with business discussions gradually giving way to more personal exchanges as the transcontinental partnership took shape. His letters hinted at a spring visit, perhaps with his wife Catherine, to further cement the family bonds and business connections. Most significantly, construction began on the house improvements Ross had promised. A crew from Julesburg, grateful for winter work, started with the kitchen expansion and modernization that Hattie had longed for. Plans for indoor plumbing were laid out for spring implementation, when the ground would be more workable. Reed and his men eventually faded from the region, their schemes disrupted by increasing scrutiny from territorial authorities and the solidarity shown by local communities like Julesburg. The land fraud operation apparently found easier targets elsewhere, though Ross maintained vigilance, never taking their security for granted. As Christmas approached, the first since their marriage, Ross reflected on the extraordinary year that had passed. From solitary rancher to husband, stepfather, and the head of a thriving, diversified operation, all because a mail-order bride had stepped off the train, older than expected but carrying precisely the wisdom he needed. The Christmas Eve celebration at Thornton Ranch was a warm affair, bringing together not just the immediate household but also friends from town, including the Campbells and, somewhat surprisingly, the Harringtons. Deanna Harrington had gradually warmed to Hattie, particularly after her husband admitted that her warning about Reed's company had potentially saved the bank from significant embarrassment and financial exposure. After the guests had departed and Elizabeth had retired to her room, Ross and Hattie sat alone before the fire in the newly expanded sitting room, enjoying the peaceful conclusion to the festive evening. "Happy?" Ross asked, his arm around his wife's shoulders as they watched the dancing flames. "Completely," Hattie confirmed, nestling closer into his embrace. "This has been the most unexpected and wonderful year of my life." "Mine too," Ross agreed, "though I have high hopes for the next year to surpass it." "Oh," Hattie looked up at him curiously. "What do you anticipate for the coming year?" Ross smiled mysteriously. "Further expansion of the crop experiment, improvements to the horse breeding program, perhaps a visit from Robert and Catherine in the spring." He paused, his expression softening. "And maybe, if we're fortunate, a new addition to the family by next Christmas." Hattie's eyes widened. "Ross, at my age that's unlikely though not impossible." "I know," he acknowledged. "But whether through miracle or perhaps one day through grandchildren visiting, I look forward to filling this house with family for years to come." "As do I," Hattie said softly, "however that family grows." As the fire burned low and Christmas Eve gave way to Christmas morning, Ross Thornton held his wife close, profoundly grateful for the unexpected wisdom that had transformed his life. The mail-order bride who had arrived older than expected had brought with her exactly what he and Thornton Ranch needed: experience, intelligence, and a heart capable of building not just a marriage but a legacy that would endure for generations to come.